Alright, welcome to part 2 of making a low angle jack plane. If you haven't watched part 1, it's probably a good idea if you do. It goes over the project, getting the frame together and all that. If you have seen it, let's start with part 2. What we need to do now that we have the basic frame made, is get the main guts of the plane finished. So the blade, the adjuster, the cap iron, and everything like that. And once we do that, it should be smooth sailing all the way to the end. So let's jump into the video. Starting with the blade, or in this case, just a blank piece of steel. The first thing we need to do is get it in the mill and get a hole drilled all the way through it. This is so it can slip over a stud that I'm going to make, and that'll hold it in place. I'll then mill a channel down the centre of the hole, with the slot being narrower than the hole we just drilled. With the hole and slot now machined, we now need to machine in a round cutout in the back of the blade. The reason for this is that it'll retain a flange on the adjusting screws, and that'll allow me to move the blade in and out. Now I've done something like this before, and doing it is pretty straightforward, and the tool that I need is a T-slot or a woodruff cutter. And thankfully I have one which is pretty much exactly the size that I need. Or at least I have most of one. Now if you remember back to the parting blade holder which I made a few weeks ago, I also had to make this custom cutter to cut the channel for the parting blade. Now making it was pretty straightforward. It's just a piece of W1 tool steel, and making it is as simple as turning down the profile, cutting the teeth, hardening, and then tempering it. But the thing is, getting a usable tool is not that difficult. Making a great tool takes a bit more skill. And as it turns out, this one wasn't. Judging by the looks of things, I didn't temper it enough, so it was a little bit too brittle, and as you can probably see, we've lost an edge. Or two. Now in fairness to the cutter, the cutting geometry and the cut, or at least getting rid of the chips, was far from perfect. In hindsight, I probably should have used a flood coolant to blast the chips from the cut. Looking back at it probably got gunked up and the teeth snapped. Either way, for a cut like that, we really shouldn't be breaking teeth like that. Thankfully, making another one is pretty straightforward, and I already know what to do. Now the change that I'm going to do here is, instead of tempering it to about 180C, I'm going to up that to about 220. According to the charts, we'll probably lose about 3 or 4 Rockwell C in hardness, but in doing so, that should make it a lot tougher and hopefully save the teeth from snapping. Alright, not the nicest sounding cut, but that seems to have come out looking pretty well. Before I refine the blade any further, I want to get the rest of the parts done, just so I know that it locks together correctly, and that I don't have to do any major design revisions. So the next thing we'll start to machine is the cap. Now the way that it works is that it locks under the front stud, and a screw wedges the back, and that should lock the blade in place. It'll do that, or it'll shear the threads in the stud, simply because there are so few of them. No, seriously, this is actually a big concern of mine. There are so few threads on that stud, and the threads aren't that big, and I am worried that the first time that I use it, the force from the wedging action is simply going to shear the threads. So I guess fingers crossed. Now like the blade, the cap also gets a larger hole, which is also followed up by a thinner slot. However, it also gets an extra hole at the back, and that's going to be threaded for a thumb screw. And that's the basic part now done. Again, I've also left it unfinished, and that's so I can see if this actually works before I do any refining. What I need to make now is the stud. Now, as I mentioned before, the threads on this need to be strong, so I'm using a piece of high tensile rod to make the part from. So the first thing I'll do is I'll turn down the steel and make that stepped profile. I'll then turn down the end so I can cut the threads on it. Alright, and those are the threads now done. I really do mean it when I say wish them luck. We can now get the part parted off. Finally, I'll get it in the mill and use a slitting saw to cut a slot for a screwdriver. And with it now installed, you can now see how it roughly fits together. However, we still need that screw to provide that wedging force. Now, like the previous part, I'll be making it on the lathe, but since this screw is thicker and it won't be seeing the same level of forces as the stud, I can make it from some normal low tensile steel, which I have a lot more of. No point in using the strong stuff if I don't need to use it. And because this is a thumb screw, it does need a nice nail pattern so I can grip it with my fingers. And with that now done, I think it looks pretty good. And whilst we're over at the lathe, we may as well make the adjustment screw at the same time. Now it starts off in much the same way as the previous screw, in that we need to get the basic profile turned down and the threads cut. Does need a section turned down to produce this flange section, which will lock into the cutout which we machined earlier on the blade. Now the fit between the cutout and the flange does not need to be exact, but the closer that I get it, probably the better, as it will result in less backlash. And with the screws now done and looking really good, let's get it all put together. Now the adjuster screw will screw into the threads which we cut into the angle block in the previous video. And the blade locks in like so. And on first impressions, we have a pretty good fit between the slot and the adjusting flange. The cap then goes on top and the screw will then wedge it all together. And given how the threads haven't blown apart, I think I'll call that a win. It's locking together tightly, and I think that's all that matters. All in all, I'm pretty happy with the build so far. So now that I know that this thing does work, let's put 5 minutes into making it look just a little bit nicer. For instance, I think 2 concave curves on the back of the cap will go a long way into making this thing look a little bit better. Although the real question is, how do I do it? First things first though, let me show you just how not to do it. I mean, don't worry, even looking back on this, I question just how I thought that this would work, because it didn't. I mean, hey, if it did work, I'd be the hero of the story, but as it turns out, no. I mean, I've never seen a hole saw flex as much as it did here. And at that point, I decided there should be a better way to do things. Now instead, I'm going to rely on good old boring to establish these arcs. Now obviously, if I try to do it all like this, it will probably take me all afternoon to remove that excess stock. So instead, what I'm going to do here is use the boring cutter as a sort of guide, so I know what sort of curve that I'm going to cut. I'll then switch over to a drill and drill a series of holes along that line, which I'll then cut. And then back at the mill, I'll use the boring head to take it to its final shape. I'll then round off the edge using a file. And then finally, I'll then take down that front edge. Say what you want, but I think that looks a lot better than it did before. So with the cap now done, I now start to modify the blade. I'm not going to do anything too complicated here. I'll just do 2 cuts on each side, and that should do the trick. And whilst it's in the mill, I'm also going to cut in the rough front geometry, which is going to be about 12 degrees. And we are still far from being done, but it's already taking a chip. And that is pretty exciting, because I have high hopes for this project, and I have a lot of furniture that I want to make, and I really need this plane to succeed. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves, because the blade is still soft, and even though it is cutting at the moment, I don't expect this blade to stay sharp for all that much longer. So I guess let's start to harden it. Now, as someone pointed out last week, this steel that I'm using here is not typical of what you'd normally use for a plain blade. I'm assuming that most people use some sort of O1 or O2 tool steel, which you can harden and grind. However, what I'm using here, or what I chose to use anyway, is mild, low carbon steel. And the issue here is that it won't quench harden to the level of hardness that we need. However, that's not going to be a problem for me, because here on this channel, I don't need tool steel. I make my own, and thankfully, it is not that hard to do. The fundamental issue is that we're lacking carbon in the steel, so let's go ahead and add some. So the first thing that I need is a steel packing box. Most of mine were either too large or too small, so I had to go and get one and cut it down. There's nothing much to them, they're just pieces of steel tube with a piece of plate welded to the bottom. So there's really no issue in just cutting one down. I'll then get the blade put in the box, and then I'll pack it with crushed charcoal, mixed in with about 5% of sodium carbonate. You don't have to do the sodium carbonate, but I do find that it does speed up the reaction, at least in the early stages of this process. I'll then go ahead and seal off the top. Normally I'd use a kiln cement, but it looks like I'm out of it, so this time I'm going to have to make do with plaster. Not my first choice, but it will do. We'll now get it in the furnace. Now we have to wait till it gets red hot and heats all the way through before it does anything, but once that starts to happen, the carbon will start to diffuse into the surface of the steel. And that'll raise the carbon content and then allow us to quench harden it once it's all finished. Incidentally though, the carbon also will diffuse into the steel backing box that I'm using, and it's progressively turning the steel into cast iron. When I was cutting it, it felt very much like part way between steel and cast iron, which would make sense. And the packing boxes do have a limited life, and after a while, they do start to crack. Now making carbon steel like this is not a fast process. The carbon diffuses inwards at a rate of about 0.1mm per hour, so I left this running for about 5 hours. Even still, the cost of propane to make this was about $5, so all up, this was much cheaper than spending about 10 times and getting a piece of W1 tool steel, which this essentially will turn into. It'll essentially turn into a piece of high carbon steel. And finally, with it all done, I'll then quench it in oil. This should give it a hardness of around 60 Rockwell C hardness. Now the remaining charcoal which I emptied out will keep on burning for a little bit, so I'll wait till morning and then collect them. And what's left is still good to be used for the next time that I need to case harden a part, although I will have to add in a bit more sodium carbonate. I'll then get it tempered in an oven at about 180°C. Now the hardness that I'm looking to get is somewhere in the high 50s Rockwell C hardness, and I have the hardness testing files to help me see roughly what I have. Now the way that it ended up here is that the 60 Rockwell C hardness file was biting in, so the hardness was less than 60. However, the 55 wasn't, but it was only just not biting in. So the hardness is somewhere between 60 and 55 Rockwell C hardness, but it's probably at the lower end, maybe 57 or 56, which is still very hard indeed and still very usable. However, because I did quench it in oil, it's now coated in a thin layer of polymerized oil residue. Now the easiest way to remove it is either to use some Scotch-Brite or some sandpaper, but first I'll soak it in some sodium hydroxide, or lye, and that should soften it up and make it a lot easier to remove. I left it soaking for about an hour, and that did wonders to start breaking down that polymerized oil. It did a really good job at breaking it down, and it very easily came off. And with it all hardened, it now goes together like that. And once again, I am really happy with how it's coming out so far. So the final thing I'll do today is get the side pieces pulled apart, and then I can add some curves, because how they are at the moment, I don't think they look very good. And because it was all screwed together, ripping the side pieces off was pretty straightforward. And I think that is a pretty cool cross section. Now I do have a rough idea of what the curves should look like, but at the end of the day, it's all freehand, and what looks good will look good. I'll also bolt them together so that they come out symmetrically. And just look at that. I mean, amazing what the difference a few curves makes. It is seriously looking like a proper plane now. I mean, really, all it's missing now are some handles at the front and the back. And at the same time, I also wouldn't mind getting rid or at least hiding those screws. The bottom also needs to be made so that it's perfectly flat. The blade also needs to be refined and given its final sharpening. I also wouldn't mind maybe some extra curves at the front and the back. And maybe some sort of lacquer or some paint just so the thing doesn't rust. And maybe some tacks or some pins just to hold everything together.